Agreement, public and private standards, labelling and traceability, fuel subsidies. Okay, we practiced just before and it was fine. I can press one. Is that all? So labelling and traceability, fuel subsidies, gender, Indigenous peoples and trade, the Pacific Island states' interests in trade, food and sustainability, and health and trade. So the project's areas of focus include both trade policy on land and trade policy on water in relation to fisheries and the blue economy. And the project potentially embraces new types of vehicles for trade policy development now found in the WTO setting, to which Maso and Rapa and Teo have recently drawn attention, including the informal dialogues, the structured discussions, the joint statement initiatives, and both traditional and new trade law processes and instruments. Now, as Markus said, on the meaning of sustainability, we take our cue from new generation thinking, evidenced in the UN Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, and appreciate the kaleidoscopic nature of sustainable development, which addresses poverty, hunger, health, education, gender equality, access to water and energy, decent work and economic growth, responsible consumption and production, climate action, aquatic and terrestrial life, peace and justice, and strong institutions, industry and innovation, infrastructure, communities and partnerships in all its facets. Sustainability is becoming an increasingly pressing matter to which trade law and policy will have to further respond. So with alterations in weather patterns, the availability of water and energy, ecosystem and soil system change, also food production technology, all these will drive quite dynamic and unpredictable shifts that are going to also push people out of work, perhaps into other work, perhaps not. And meantime, you've got the growth in digital services, the proliferation of business models like subcontracting and franchising and fractional contracts and long distance work, etc. So these many transformations in working life. Okay, so it's very, very early days. The adoption of standards backed by sufficiently sophisticated traceability mechanisms seems to be one of the key pathways forward across many of the domains of sustainable trade. And if you looked at the Villas report, you'll see that it proposes prompt action on standards in relation to greenhouse gas measurement, greenhouse gas pricing, deforestation, biodiversity, fishing and marine products, core labour rights and circular commerce. So manufactured goods, agricultural products and fisheries products are the leading contenders to attract labour and environmental standards, including diverse food products. And my notes tell me I'm at 3.5 minutes now. So let's move to our next slide for the other half. Oh, too early. Okay, we missed the first one. That was the first one, but we're good now. All right, so among the emerging themes in the project are the multiple international legal regimes governing the subject matter, including institutionally the FAO, the ILO, the Law of the Sea Convention, the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this intersection between trade, food, and sustainability is increasingly coming through quite loud and clear in the major environmental fora. So the Paris Agreement's 2024 global stocktake urged parties and non-party stakeholders to increase ambition, to accelerate swift action towards, inter alia, attaining climate resilient food and agricultural production, supply and distribution of food, and increasingly sustainable and regenerative production and equitable access to adequate food and nutrition for all. Progress will nevertheless be hard to achieve in the climate fora, arguably putting the ball back in the court of international trade to a significant extent. But there are also a variety of institutional circles to try and square along the way. So, for example, there is a major gap on addressing food-related emissions in the global stocktake decision. the climate decision. And also equally, actually, in the 2023 COP28 Emirates Declaration on Sustainable Agriculture, Resilient Food Systems and Climate Action. There's also a growing focus on both land and water-based food systems around the world under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And then in 2024, the UN Pact for the Future put food very near the top of its list of concerns, in place number 3 out of 56 action points, following the commitment to the SDGs for 2030 and eliminating poverty. And the Pact for the Future linked food to trade concerns, including subsidies and market access reform. The Declaration for Future Generations, adopted at the same time, includes commitments to food security in its guiding principles. We know that cooperation at a global scale is key, as Joel Trachtman emphasised in Geraldo and Kathleen's book, The Sustainability Revolution. And yet progress seems at times most advanced at the bilateral level. So the New Zealand-EU Free Trade Agreement, the New Zealand-UK Free Trade Agreement, the Singapore-Australia Green Economy Agreement provide some quite leading and remarkable examples among their diverse chapters. And of course, the new and unprecedented dispute settlement and enforcement mechanisms can potentially hold the parties to account for conduct inconsistent with the Paris Agreement and the core conventions in the labour and gender fields and environmental as well. So the EU-UK agreement stands out for the parties' commitment to climate protection and non-regression on carbon pricing, and its provision for trade concession rebalancing in case of significant divergences in labour, social, environmental, climate protection, as Geraldo has highlighted. Plurilaterally, the ACCTS breaks new ground on eco-labelling, fossil fuel subsidies, market liberalisation. We may be able to talk about that more. And then you've got the regional free trade agreements and Pasha Tse's work on green regionalism as well. So perhaps briefly, one of the most fascinating questions to me is the idea of putting a global price on carbon to establish its social and environmental cost, as referred to in the Villas framework, and ideally in line with the Paris Agreement's temperature goal. Some do view the WTO as a natural forum for working on this, and with the support of the DG and dare one say, one imagines the Secretariat, there has of course been technical workshopping in the WTO and the establishment of an international carbon pricing task force with the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the UNFCCC and UNCTAD. But what will carbon pricing do to the production, distribution of accessibility and food? And then there's the related matter of how to work through the really large, overarching, core, critical questions of North-South debates. And that is one of the reasons why sustainability may be most challenging to negotiate in the multilateral space in the big trade fora, because at the one time we need all countries to be involved in these talks, and at the other time the progress really does seem often blocked in the WTO. I will leave it there. Thank you very much, Markus. Fast, I know.
Thank you, Caroline, for sticking to the time. That leaves much more room for discussion, by the way. The idea is to have this as a conversation. And a conversation, I have plenty of questions for all of the speakers. They've all told me that my questions were way too difficult. Michelle has already asked DeepSeek, and apparently DeepSeek said it's too difficult to answer, which is great. I don't know whether we have a particular order, but Michelle, I'll just pick you next. I cannot get Ashutosh can go next. I'm sure he's not. He's a. Yeah, you're going next because you're next in my list. And as a German, I believe in lists, right? So Michelle is one of the sort of perennial happy people in international economic law. That's sort of the way that I would describe it, in addition to being a brilliant scholar whose work I have benefited from greatly. And you do have a PowerPoint slide there. Ah, good. There you go. And we've known each other now for probably well over 10 years, probably more than that. And this one I found particularly sort of both fascinating and tricky.
Yeah, don't ask.
Michelle's bitten off a fairly large chunk by talking about navigating dual goals. I'll let you explain what those dual goals are. Your 7 minutes are running. No 10, 7?
All right.
We're not in Jakarta traffic.
I'll try it. So, all right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Markus. So, hello, everyone. So I'm just like start with something that's very familiar, especially you are now in Asia. We love rice. So, well, we have rice for breakfast, for lunch, and yes, for dinners. Even in Indonesia, we even say you haven't eaten if you haven't had rice. So that's very essential for us. So when the government says we need to import rice, people often react very strong that how come we not produce our own rice? So it is then not surprise at all when self-sufficiency is often be assumed as a way to ensure food security. And that's also, that belief is also reflected in our food law. So the law only allows the government to import staple foods, including rice, when domestic production and national reserve are insufficient. So I try to explore this compatibility of these two goals. One hand, food security; on the other hand, self-sufficiency. Like you said, Markus, this is already old issue actually, and many scholars already argue, and I agree with them that they are both not the same. But still, I'm quite fascinated with these two goals. So I began first by looking at Indonesia experience in implementing self-sufficiency programs on two staple foods. We consider there are 5 staple foods, but here I just like gonna explain the 2 of them: rice and beef. So first is rice. Rice is already, the effort began long time, even soon after Indonesia got independent in 1945. There was a program called the Kasimo Plan. Kasimo was the Minister for Food Affairs. So there was a plan, but it failed because there was just mostly because post-independence challenges like political instability, poor infrastructure, limited resources, and underdeveloped agricultural system. But then in 1960, around 1965 to 1916, around 1965, the government launched what is called BIMAS program, or mass guidance, they call it. So this program aimed to boost rice production. And during this time, actually, Indonesia has improved. They had already better infrastructure, more stable institutions, better support, including assistance from international organizations. And it worked. In 1984, Indonesia became, or we claim, to be self-sufficient in rice. Well, yeah, but it didn't last. Then the decades followed is around 1966 to 1997. There was growth caused by El Nino, and don't forget we hit also by an Asia financial crisis. And this is led to actually rise in security. So that's one part. The second part is beef. So beef is quite unique. We launched, and this is actually very famous, we launched in 2010 a program called Beef Self-Sufficiency program. It launched that one. And it stated the target for 2014. So the target, the self-sufficiency target, sorry, very loud. Okay, I'm loud, so I don't need that mic. So the target...
We have people online.
No. Okay, then no need. Extra 1 minute.
No.
So okay, 14. Okay, look at this, 14 million cattle. So the aim is to. Oh, okay. This is complicated, Markus. I'm excited, you know. It's like karaoke. Yeah, okay. But anyway, the target is 14 million cattle. We want to reach that 14 million cattle in 2014. But very interestingly, we have a census in 2011. It's called beef cattle census. And the census found out we already have 14.8 million cattle in 2011. So it's already surpassing the target in 2014. So I said either we achieve self-sufficiency early or there were data inconsistency between government agencies. But but what happened then in 2013, beef prices soaring, double within 3 months, and people complaining. And then this is forced the government to relax import. So that's what I want to say here from these two, our experiences. We can tell that, well, self-sufficiency, it is achievable, but not sustainable. So that's one, and then also I'm also look at in the region. So in the region, actually, like countries, ASEAN countries, like Indonesia and Philippines, we keep continue pursuing self-sufficiency. But we also have a region called Singapore, of course, that Singapore rely on this approach self-reliance. So Singapore more rely on international trade and innovation to build a strong food supply. So, but I want to say that these two approaches actually, well, it has limitation. That's why in my paper, I said that, hey, let's have to see about the regional cooperation. And this is two regional cooperation that I look at so far. It's about Asian +3 emergency rice reserve and food security information system. So I want very quick on this one. So, okay. So this is the mechanism. So this rice reserve is triggered by three mechanism, and this is based on the emergency. So they are anticipated and when it has an acute emergency, here is mostly the tier 3 is about humanitarian assistance. 1 and 2 is based on the contract. The difference one, the first tier is pre-agreed forward, and the other one is after the emergency. So because of the time, I'm just like leave it here. This is more on the informations, how we share the data informations to have collaboration. Thank you, Markus.
Thank you. Look, the timing is fairly strict with 7 minutes, but that also leaves more time for questions and answers, and you can always put some more information into your answers because you will get questions, as you know. Ashutosh Kashyap is from the Center for Trade Investment Law. I'm not going to go into all the acronyms that follow that, but basically a Indian government think tank that is now, I think that's fair to say, advising the Indian government on trade negotiations and litigation strategies overall. I think I've visited a number of times now, your paper is much more looking at sort of sustainable food systems and the way that concept, which runs almost completely counter, but we'll see, to the food safety paradigm of the SPS agreement, how to reconcile those things outside of the legal world. Sustainable food systems have been discussed since the 1980s, but we, as always, are very late to the party. You can tell us how we can dance, or maybe we can't. 7 minutes.
Yes.
Increase the volume for you.
Or I'll try to be loud if I'm not audible. Yeah. So a very good afternoon, everyone. As Markus pointed out, my intervention will largely be focused on sustainable food system, but I'll confine my intervention on tracing the confluence or increasing traction of sustainable food system in the international trading regime. So I would cover a wider areas, and I would also cover where it's being discussed and how it's slowly and slowly it's transforming into a separate legal system. And I'll also, while I do that, I'll also try and give a glimpse of how that regulation may look like in the future. And in doing so, I will try and discuss 3 main aspects. One will be on the definition aspect on how it's being defined in its increasing confluence with international trade. Second, on the regulatory autonomy and sovereignty with individual countries. And third will be on related topics, sustainable food system versus security, and also food sovereignty. And this is linked to the cultural context and cultural ties. So in this sustainable food system in trade agreement gained traction after MC12 discussion, when a dedicated group was formed to discuss SFS development. There was no development in MC13. At least there was no development which was visible in MC13. But if you look carefully at all the meeting documents, you will see one union, one bloc outstanding and pushing countries to discuss this particular aspect. And that bloc is European Union. And this is also visible if you look again into the new generational free trade agreements of European Union. So you see a number of trade agreements signed, concluded, and ongoing by EU, which includes New Zealand, Chile concluded now, ongoing Indonesia, India, and Philippines. You'll see they have now pushed for a dedicated chapter on sustainable food system. Now these chapters, it is yet to be examined how these chapters overlap with SPS discipline, and also with some of the obligations under TSD chapters in those agreements, so trade and sustainable development. And before I come to the EU PTAs and I give you concrete examples and how that looks like and where are the problems, I would also like to draw examples. So as Markus said, that this sustainable food system in itself is not a new concept. What is new is this being included in an international trading regime, the increasing discussion, and the confusion as to where to fit this in the system, in the current existing system. So that's what the new is, and that's where we need to really focus and discuss. And there are also some examples of PTAs, and I'm also not going into the agreement, individual agreements which may be between countries for individual food products. So we see some agreements between Japan and Australia, and there is another Korea and Australia, I guess, which has this food system relation only focusing on the food supply chain. So I guess that it relates to sufficiency, and that those agreements also focus on certain food items. You can also find a correlation of these discussions with now the discussion surrounding critical materials, where you have approached an annex-based approach where you want certain materials to ensure the sufficiency of certain material. You want to have some control over the supply chain of such material. So similarly, that existed for the food system a few years ago. And now EU in its PTA, as I was saying, has started with a dedicated chapter. I'll come to that later eventually. So now the another important block, which has discussed this issue for some time now, at least for a decade now, is G20, which represents significant chunk of world's GDP and significant number of countries in the globe. So in G20, we see, for example, in my intervention, I've taken example from G20's Rome Summit of 2021, Brisbane Summit of 2014, and 2015 Summit, wherein all these declarations which culminated, largely deals with wider representation. It recognizes the cultural context that food system has. It also recognizes how marginal and wider stakeholders are in the system who are required to be present in the policy formulation. It talks about investment in newer technologies, sustainable food system, etc. And also on this aspect, I'd also like to draw two examples from India. So as Bissell was saying, that unless they eat rice, the food is not complete. For us, there is no saying. But for me, this is same. And I'm sure that this is also same for many part in the India. So sometimes this cultural ties exist beyond national boundaries. Sometimes you find these cultural ties rooted in historical context also. For example, India is one of the country which faced extreme famine situation, which was a man-made famine. So I don't know if you have heard about this, but in Bengal, famine is a popular famine. It was during colonial rule in India. And after that, they started growing potato. And now that region grows potato. And post-independence, similar to Missile intervention, there were two revolutions in India to increase production of a particular food product in order to gain food sufficiency, self-sufficiency in other words. I will take one example of Green Revolution, wherein Indian government incentivized production of wheat and paddy in order to supply to its citizen. And I hope you know that India's population is one of the largest, probably the largest. So this was a particular province in India, Punjab, who started doing this. But now government realizes that we have too much of wheat and paddy, which is not being used. Basically, it's rotting in the stock lot and houses. So now they want them to move to other products. And also Punjab is a region where water, it does not rain naturally. They don't get sufficient water through natural rains. This is what they draw from groundwater, which is an unsustainable practice. So they're slowly shifting towards a sustainable practice and slowly shifting the agricultural practices to adopt to other agricultural products. Now, EU's now I'll come to the EU definitional aspect. I'll just touch on the definition aspect. So in EU's FTA, I took 4 examples. So on definition, you will see that New Zealand, Chile, India, and Indonesia, all 3 have different definition. Sustainable food system, there is no uniform definition. There is one which is widely recognized as FAO's definition. And in New Zealand's, in the EU's FTA with New Zealand, the definition talks about flexibility. It recognizes that it can have diverse social context. In Chile's definition, it talks specifically on different sustainability aspects, for example, economic, social, environmental, and it also ties it with certain example to give fixed meaning. As opposed to that, in India, Indonesia, the definition is much wider. It talks about number of things which may probably be accommodated within one of the aspects of sustainability. For example, it talks about food consumption, including healthy diets. No one knows how this will be ensured, and things like that. And I'll come maybe later in my intervention to other things. Thank you so much.
All right, I've been given the microphone that's wired apparently, so I hold all the power now. No, so thank you so much for all your initial presentations. The way we wanted to do this is, like I said, to have a conversation. So the first question I actually have is, are there any specific questions for any of the panelists to clarify something? Because if there are, then I think that goes first. I have plenty of questions for them. Apparently it's too scary for DeepSeek, maybe not for others. We'll see. If there's not, then I guess my first question is, and that's sort of a question that I haven't told you actually as much.
Oh no.
But no. But it sort of brings these 3 papers together. It actually builds on a question I've asked each one of you, and that is, all of you are dealing with an issue that I think is haunting international economic law and has been haunting international economic law for quite some time, namely the trade and debate. And you're supercharging this in some ways because you're looking at not only one factor, but you're looking at a multitude of factors to try to reconcile this, right? So in the past, we talked about trade and health, trade and environment, and we try to basically sort of say what we lawyers tend to do. We have one value, we have another value, we try to reconcile 2 competing values with one another. The Germans would say proportionality is the way out for this. Now you're talking, and this is Caroline saying 360-degree concept, where you're looking at trade, environment, labor, and everything else that you mentioned. And so I'm trying to figure out, in your case, are we overwhelming what we generally can do? A very similar question for Ashutosh, right? Where if we think about sustainability, and I should mention, number one, the paper is co-written with Vishaka Srivastava, and I've also had a role in this at some point in time. We're working on the project together on sustainable food systems. But the original thinking of sustainability was what? Economic, environmental, and social. Again, one of those much larger, much trickier concepts. And the EU is sort of almost giving up on the social concept by now, and on the environmental concept in light of current developments is putting a much bigger emphasis on the economic one. Third one is also sort of goes in the same way, sort of in the same direction, Michelle. You're trying to reconcile, in your case, a little bit less sort of multitude, but also how do you reconcile these competing interests? So it's a question that goes for every single one of you. It's not a complete surprise, but I thought I would sort of try to get a conversation started amongst the 3 of you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mikey.
Start. Okay, thanks, Markus. And you're a wonderful chair because you've crafted some fantastic questions, and that's one of them. Some of them we've also got as well. Okay, so is the trade and debate now supercharged, and are we making it unmanageable? Well, certainly for authors of a project which in theory embraces all the SDGs, the word unmanageable does come to mind. But in the same way that international law and international economic law will find its way through, we will find our way through with the project. And there's a parallel there, that there will be progress made in various respects. But I did want to just, I guess, cast another light on what you said about the trade and debate, because you're right. For a long time, we've regarded these things as separate. There's trade and there's, labor, environment, whatever it may be, development, of course. But now maybe we're reaching a realization that the reality is that it is not trade and. So the reality is that it is environment in trade, development in trade, sustainability in trade, that the physical realities of the interdependent world that we have created in quite large part through international economic law and the industrialization and the climate change and all the other emissions, et cetera, have led us to this point. And actually, our international economic law hasn't really caught up. And just the other sort of siloification, if that is a word, that it would be lovely to draw attention to, perhaps at this point, is to me something that stands out an absolute mile. We all know that we are expecting the International Court of Justice to hand down an advisory opinion on climate change on the 23rd of July. So I asked myself, will they say anything about trade? I don't think they will say anything about trade. They're not, it is a court, epistemically grounded in these issues.
They're not asked to do that.
Well, they're not asked to do it. I think it'll be in there implicitly, Markus, because my bet is that they will talk about cooperation. And it's implicit in that if we're going to address the climate change and sustainability issues, there's going to have to be far greater international economic cooperation. So ultimately, they may mandate that, but not expressly.
I take this sort of, anytime anyone has a question, just raise your hands, please. I want this to be as interactive as possible, but I'll make it interactive now in some sense, because I'll foreshadow just one thing. As a scholar, I do not disagree with Caroline whatsoever. As a someone who also works in the space of geopolitics and geoeconomics, and as sort of a realist in that space, I wonder whether we can get to that point in the current environment where interdependence and the kumbaya moment of the 1990s would have been the perfect place to do that. The world of 2025 looks very different, right? And so that's sort of the next question that I will throw at you anyway. You know this because we exchanged questions beforehand, but that's one of the things. Can we replicate that in the current environment in which the willingness of countries to engage meaningfully with one another and make compromises seems to me at least to be much more diminished than it used to be. Ashutosh, but you're...
Yes. As Markus asked the question, I'll focus on I will again relook at the approaches that I highlighted in the initial intervention, and I'll focus on how these approaches focus on one thing or another. It's not a comprehensive strategy. It's definitely not a balanced strategy, balancing all three pillars. So I'll start with G20 example. So you would recall that I said that it's largely tied in larger participation. So I will read out some of those. For example, the Material Declaration G20 Rome Summit talks about increasing investment, and it talks about it also talks about protecting the interest of small marginal farmers, increasing stakeholder consultations, especially of the marginal section. Another summit talks about engagement of women, youth, smallholder. Another talks about knowledge sharing, etc., for successful initiative and encouraging such transformation. So if you see all of these carefully, the word which repeats and the essence of all of those are tied in the cultural context, social pillar of sustainability. Now, if you look at the other one, which the PTAs, initial PTAs, which I gave examples, which are not European PTAs necessarily, wherein the focus was on the supply chain, it can be said, it can be argued to follow one pillar of sustainability, which is tied to the economic aspect. And sometimes, like in the case of Indonesia, it may also have cultural ties, where cultural ties are related to a particular food item, but it primarily deals with economic aspect of it. Now coming to EU's PTA. So I'd already given you a glimpse of the definitional aspect. Now I'll move forward. I'll see how it looks within the EU's regime. So EU proposed this in their trade agreement as plan of 360-degree approach. I'll borrow from Caroline's intervention. So what they did, they have their Green Deal. Under the Green Deal, they had a number of things. They're touching on a number of things. I don't know how that will be reconciled. I personally think no one knows how those things will be reconciled. Second thing is that under the Green Deal, they had farm to focus strategy, which is again, they proposed a comprehensive strategy. Then EU was supposed to come up with a legislative framework to deal with sustainable food system, which I believe that they would have planned to balance all the pillars of sustainability. It was supposed to come out in 2023. As of now, also, there is no development. Then if you see within the EU space, other than interagency coordination, developed interaction and international trade, so they're pushing it at WTO, they are pushing it at bilateral level, they must be pushing it at plurilateral level as well. In the internal regime, they have come up with organic farming regulation. They have conditional tariff preference in FTA with Mercosur. In their GSP system, generalized system of preference, they offer additional trade benefit if there is a strict adherence to EU standard. EU also proposed a sustainability labeling framework, which is largely tied to the TBT aspect. So now if you see the EU's approach, it again is only economic driven. We don't know where the focus lies. Social context is definitely missing in this one. So we see that there is no balanced approach, but moving forward, there is need to have larger discussion, larger participation of the countries, more voices in the room, and other than being inclusive, it has to move toward a system where it's clear what we want to achieve, and the approach has to be balanced. I'll wait for next person. Thank you.
Also, good luck to all of us in trying to make all of these things happen in the current, in the current environment. Whether that's achievable is, I think, a big question mark.
Okay, that's why my paper less ambitious. I try not to solve that. I mean, I think it's like unsolvable. So look, the thing is like I already presented, we already tried to implement self-sufficiency programs, and it failed. But even until now, self-sufficiency still the core agricultural policy of Indonesia. So I call it, maybe we curious. We try, fail, we keep going and try until we succeed. So the thing is, because in reality, it's always gonna be the core, it's gonna be there. So how we manage? And we know that I brought these two regional cooperation. One is about rice emergency reserve. The other one is about food security information system. So, I mean, there are this cooperation, which I think this is could help us first to anticipate by sharing information about the situation, the food security informations. And the other one is when something happens, we can work to manage the risk. So this is the cooperation that I think that, well, at the same time, we cannot get rid this policy, but if something maybe bad happen, at least we can work together to manage the risk. So that's from me. Thank you.
Right. Any questions from the audience? I'll just keep coming back to you to try to draw you in. If I can't, then I'll just continue. Yes. I think we might have to give you a microphone because it's being recorded.
We've also got your question banked.
So we'll get there.
I like this.
What's that? Yeah, good.
Yes, thank you so much. I must first of all admit that I arrived a bit later, so my apologies for not having, for not being able to follow the discussion from the very start. But I was intrigued by a comment by Caroline regarding the upcoming advisory opinion, and I just probably have a comment more than a direct question, but I think I would be happy if there were any reactions to that. Very recently, just a couple of days ago, there was an Inter-American Court of Human Rights advisory opinion on climate, which was actually quite interesting. Very, very, I found it a great reading. And to go back to Caroline's point, there is actually a paragraph on the interplay with international investment law, and the court really basically stresses that latest investment agreements and model bilateral investment treaties could really contribute through clauses on environmental protection and climate change to sustainability issues, but also stresses sometimes investment regime being at odds, right, with these general goals, and also says, I'm quoting, this tension is not inherent to the investment regime, but depends on the regulatory design and use of dispute settlement mechanism. And therefore, it really urges to, the importance of striking the right balance. So how does this fit within this discussion, and do you see hope in this sense if you read this advisory opinion and what we can expect for the next one? Yeah.
You might collect a couple of questions. I think Tracy also had her hand up, so yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, a question for Michelle. Just interested, is this me that's making this noise? The high-pitched noise? That one? Oh, I think sometimes when I was moderating, you had to turn that one off. Yeah, otherwise it did weird things. Sorry, yeah, Indonesia's food security or self-sufficiency policy. I guess I was just curious, like, I understand the rationale for it, and you talked about the importance of rice and beef as well to, the people of Indonesia, but to what extent does that self-sufficiency goal get, I guess, polluted by protectionism, by the agricultural sector wanting to keep imports out? And I just wondered to what extent those two collide. And I guess also, as far as my understanding is that some of Indonesia's food law, it's not just about rice and beef, but there's also some, restrictions on things like onions and various other horticultural products. So yeah, just interested in how you see those two, I don't know, interests or motivations playing out.
Great. I mean, that's the almost perennial question, right? In international trade law, what particular lobbying group stands behind whatever policy might be implemented? Is there one, or is it a sort of an objective policy? I think we have another question, and then we'll come back to the panel.
My question is for Professor Caroline. In your opening slide, you mentioned that when we talk about seeking sustainability, there is this multiple overlapping international legal framework. And this also connects to Professor Ilaria's question regarding the ruling of the ICJ and the ruling of the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, and how all of these international dispute settlement bodies are trying to reconcile different legal principles from international environmental law, trade law, human rights as well. And therefore, linking this to the concept of SFS, the concept of sustainable food systems also incorporates these varying considerations from trade law, from environmental law, and even from human rights, because the concept of food sovereignty, which is broader than the concept of SFS or food security, it also incorporates the human rights element, that is the cultural and the political context to it. So how do you see there's a possibility of reconciling all of these different set of legal principles and coming up with a solution which is more coherent and easy to understand? Thank you.
All right, there's plenty of food for thought for now. So I won't be coming in with my questions. Michelle, do you want to start off from here, and then we'll go?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's very short, like, all right. So the protectionism behind that, so maybe I will start with, we have what is called economic nationalism. So that's part of like the idea of, we've been colonized that for so long. And also in the constitutions, there's Article 33 where it said it's land, water, literally that essential for the people. It's utilized and managed by the state for the welfare of the people, something like that, which actually eventually is interpreted and lead to the economic nationalism. That's why the idea is for staples, and they define there's 5 products actually, and now more, I cannot really remember, but rice, beef, soy, sugar, and there are other products that, because of this idea of economic nationalism, it has to be produced by our own. So we have to be self-sufficient. And the idea of it, because of Indonesia very rich, the idea that we have natural resources, we have water, enough land, the arable land. So why this is not becoming or why we cannot become self-sufficient? So politically, it's very what's call it appealing. And that's what they use. But I cannot go like, for example, like cattle, for example, or beef. Of course, we have local or domestic beef producers, and it's grown mostly in the eastern part of Indonesia, and majority the biggest consumption is actually in Java. But the thing is, we also know that beef from Australia is actually much cheaper than local beef that produced within Indonesia. So probably because of infrastructure, but also, and I mean, I'm not really look at this one. It's also because maybe of cartels. So there are very complex issue here. So the idea is, I know, like you said, there's so many multi dimensions. I don't want to do another thesis about this one. So I try to be more look at on this, how this, when you have this idea, when you cannot get rid of that, the self-sufficiency. So if something happen, is there any mechanism that we can utilize to mitigate the risk? So I'm looking at this regional cooperation that maybe could help. But again, also regional cooperation, and this is under ASEAN plus 3, so ASEAN country plus China, Japan, and South Korea. But at the same time, it's ASEAN again. So sometimes you have the mechanism, but not fully utilized up to the potential. So yeah, that's
great. Caroline. And I'll probably follow up with a couple of questions because I might be a bit more skeptical about the ICJ and other mechanisms than you guys are. But
Okay, so maybe we can join the two questions up. And maybe we can turn, in fact, to the advisory opinion from the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And I do that because, of course, it has quite an interest in fish, and fish are pretty important in our global food supply. So that advisory opinion does, of course, draw attention to the fact that climate change is going to cause changes in fish stocks and abundance and location and so forth. And it does that under the context of elaborating the obligation of states parties to UNCLOS to protect the marine environment, preserve and protect the marine environment. So then there is the obligation to do this. There are problems with fish stocks. So effectively, it is a kind of a directive inter alia to regional fisheries management organizations to be proactive about this. And this is a legal obligation under UNCLOS. And it identifies that the standard is one of not even just due diligence, but stringent due diligence. It's taking matters extremely seriously. Now, the other main obligation that the ITLOS advisory opinion elaborates is not to pollute the oceans. And so that's another obligation under UNCLOS. And it says, yes, this does apply to greenhouse gas emissions, and it applies to greenhouse gas emissions on land. So we now have an international agreement that's been authoritatively clarified as holding states party, who are many, to really quite a high standard in terms of actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This is completely distinct from the Paris Agreement regime. This is completely distinct also from customary international law. So that's pretty significant. And they also say, and this maybe ties back to trade, states just don't have an individual obligation to do these things. They also have an obligation to do it together. So it comes back to that theme of international legal requirements for cooperation. And that is really the last note, I guess, that I'll strike, which is that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights advisory opinion, which está en español, entonces no lo he leído todavía. I will read it when I get home, when I get time to. I don't know whether I'm going to print out 230 pages of Spanish and spend a lot of time on it, or wait for the authoritative English version, or read the summary. It's tricky, isn't it, as a researcher? But I did have a quick look, and there is quite a big section on cooperation. I doubt I'm going to find trade mentioned, but I'm very happy to draw that link.
So I'm just going to push back because that's what I do. And I want to draw you, and this comes back to the questions that I asked you. I want to draw you back into the reality of today. So the reality of today is a fairly bleak one, and I think most people that know me will say that I try to be cheerful, but at the moment I'm not. Right? The moment of sort of pure lawyering, in some sense, is somewhat over, and there's lots of things happening that militate against sort of not looking at the sort of reality of today, the lack of cooperation, this inward-looking trajectory that we're on. We used to talk about friendshoring, we used to talk about nearshoring. That day is over. We're all talking about reshoring. Now, we're somewhat colored by the Trumpian world, and maybe there's a space where other countries are working together a little bit better, but I don't see that happening yet. So this moment that we've all been educated in, at least I'm old enough to say this, where we sort of came together. I was born in the 1970s. The Berlin Wall falls in 1989. Unification happens in 1990. The bipolar world comes into sort of a unipolar world, but then moves forward, and the end of history didn't come. But are those goals that these mechanisms, and this is more for Caroline and Ashutosh, less you, because you're saying I'm doing a narrower version of all of this, and therefore I'll have more questions for you later on. Is that achievable in the current geopolitical environment? Or to what, the yes/no answer is always bad, question is always bad, but to what extent do you see challenges in achieving this, and to what extent do you see actual opportunities to get there? Not sort of wishful thinking that we in academia oftentimes do, but the hard-nosed realism that at the moment I'm having real trouble. Convince me that I'm wrong, please.
Are we working? Yeah, great. Okay. I am astonished at the level of substantive concrete discussion at this conference on potential ways forward. Now, I wasn't in Bogota, so I've had a little bit of a gap in exposure, but I'm astonished, and I hope that it's been encouraging for you too, Marcus. Some of the tools that are being discussed, the session just now, even the fact we're trying to get into the nitty-gritty of balancing questions between what do we do with our subsidies law, the mere thought of actually developing or reinterpreting the subsidies agreement. For instance, the discussions about regulatory measures and aviation fuels this morning and offshore energy. So that's a little bit, we are pushing hard with tools in various ways. I know what you mean exactly, but at the same time, I'm going to pull us back to the big picture. And I'm also going to say it's not an if question, it's a when and a how question. And the when is the critical part. It's really how much damage is going to be done first before we can start to act better together. And I am really conscious of both the national and the institutional ideological pre-commitments that stand in our way. But I'm also conscious of the dynamics outside of maybe the circles in which we move or with which we intersect. And so there's a lot to be said for all of the things that academics often talk about, but there really is a lot to be said for them. Things like public-private engagement, citizen motivation, communication of climate knowledge, and maybe even enabling people to understand the centrality of international trade law to helping address and resolve these issues. Because I think there's a very, very big gap in public knowledge there.
So you've been surprised at the constructivism that has happened in the last few days. I'm surprised that Trump hasn't been mentioned far more frequently, given today's news. And I used to live in Brazil, so I'll just use that example, that all of a sudden poor Brazil goes from 10% to 50% because someone, and I asked this question of a friend of mine who works in the foreign ministry in Brazil. I haven't gotten an answer yet. Is this because someone in Brazil wants regime change? and therefore there's a push towards Bolsonaro being very close, and that's been mentioned. So I'm just far more skeptical of this inward-looking turn overall, not just by Trump, but also other spaces. And this comes back to you, Ashutosh, now. The fourth person who was supposed to be on this panel is a member of the European Commission, Klaus Blank. And I had a different conversation with him over email, and he sort of indicated, this is why I mentioned this, that SFS, Sustainable Food Systems, is sort of been replaced by sort of a new vision for. And that takes in far less of these aspirational goals of social and environmental concerns, but focuses much more on this hard-nosed element of inward-looking sustainability on the economic side, right? So again, in the current environment, with maybe your hat for advising the Indian government as well, how do we reconcile this in the current environment? How do we achieve this? Again, these goals that I personally fully share. I think the world will go up in flames. My students always crucify me when I say anything like this. They always say, Markus, you're far too negative. And I was like, no, I'm totally realistic. No one's told you yet, but here you go. You get into second, third, fourth year of law school. Finally, someone tells you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I also agree with the sentiment that the desire is always to have uniform rules, harmonization, and everything. But the desires are not always fulfilled, especially given the current scenario, it will be difficult. But I would personally draw from the word that you used. So now it's not about near-shoring, friend-shoring. It's about reshoring. So even when we see the discussion of near-shoring, it's not actually about near-shoring. It's about control, and then it becomes reshoring discussion. So in terms of food systems also, the discussion is that. And I think US is not the only country which is doing this. EU is also the bloc which is inward looking. In fact, all their circular economy deal and everything, all of it is inward looking only to achieve self-sufficiency in some way. You can relate that to waste shipment regulation and other things. Same goes for other countries. So now when all the countries who are supposed to discuss some of the issues together and some of the issues which should be primary issues, the first problem is that these issues are not considered primary. They are discussed inside. For example, sustainable food system discussion should be given much importance, but it's in the discussion, it's one of the chapters, and I don't think it receives as much importance as it should. And in the Trumpian era, where tariff is again back, and I ran into someone who was saying that the customs practice of 33 decades ago has again resurfaced. So it seems that we are being drawn backwards rather than moving forward. So when we are drawn backwards, it complicates things. And the second thing is, in the inward looking, we don't know if we'll run into each other with the same problem, or if we have the same problem, because we are not looking together, the countries are not looking together. So there are minimal chances of finding a solution. But having said that, there is a need to find solution. There is need to give importance to smaller, innocuous seeming topics like sustainable food system. And there is need to have a wider discussion in order to gain something, gain something which is true and which is real and which makes impact.
I'll get to Vishaka in a moment. I just want to draw in Michelle. You're like, oh my God, I'm back on. No, but I want to ask you a specific question, one of the ones that I asked you before. But it ties in with this question. So in the early 2000s, when one of these mechanisms that you described, the UPTIER, is this a type of arrangement that was useful at the time? Or is this something that's still realistic to be implemented today when, again, countries are inward looking more than they used to be before? What do you like? It's an honest question, right? I don't know what the answer is. You might have to explain what it is. It's one that you had, I think, as one of the last slides, where there were 3 tiers and so forth. Is that a realistic way that you see making a difference in times of potential crisis that goes beyond just one country? Because we saw this during COVID times, we saw it afterwards, where countries, and even within the European Union, where there's supposed to be a fairly strong crisis mechanisms where countries are supposed to help one another during COVID times, that fell apart very, very quickly, even in a community that is supposed to work together, right? So
Okay, very quick. Yes, it's like it's actually it has a long history, but then it's kind of like refurbished and relaunched again in 2000, around 2000. Look, Marcus, crisis. No, I mean, look at no. I'm thinking about that. It's always it's a recurring events. Like droughts, typhoon. We just got typhoon, and sometimes it's unanticipated. Sometimes you cannot predict. Some event maybe you can predict it's gonna coming, but others like it's just like that, like the COVID. That's why I mean, like actually this Asian plus 3 emergency risk reserve is for me it's like it's a brilliant program. It has 3 tiers, which is try to anticipate and also that you already can predict, but at the same time it's about cooperation, the tier 3. And the tier 3 is actually humanitarian aid, and that's happening during the COVID time when Japan actually helping the others less developed country. And even like last year, the earthquake Myanmar, they donated actually certain. The problem is actually tier 2.
So this was my question, right?
Yeah.
So tier 3 is easy. Tier 3 is easy because tier 3, basically there's a crisis and human beings are conditioned to help one another. I actually personally honestly believe that. Ever since I did my bicycle trip from Germany to China, I do think people actually want to help one another, right? Like not that I needed help every day, but people are conditioned to help one another. The tricky one is where you don't see an immediate sort of effect, but it's that tier 2, right? That where you sort of have a longer term project that needs to be sort of.
Oh no, that's a tier 1.
That's tier 1.
So tier 1 is like pre-arranged contract. So you
tier 2 is what?
2 is actually you don't have contract, but if something happened, then you just negotiate very quickly and on agreed terms. And that one had never been used. Tier 1, they have this just been used by Japan and Philippines. They have a memorandum of cooperation being extended until 2027 now, where they allocate around like, so they try to use it.
But 1 second, right? That's a contract that's predictable.
Yes.
Whereas the second one is it's
as anticipated one.
Unanticipated and not really predictable because there's no contract in place.
That's
That's never been
used. That's not being used, and this is actually again, I don't know why.
Okay.
Well, look, my things is like sometimes this is like, and everyone maybe know ASEAN, they have mechanism, but sometimes they never invoke or they don't use. So this is one of, I think, well, that's actually one of the downsides. So for me, it's kind of like you never know whether this is effective if you never been used. You never know what you need to improve if you never been used. So yes. So in the end, again, maybe look, this is like being launched around 2003 or something like that. Tier 1 and tier 3, especially tier 3 is being used very often, but we have to look at again when they're going to use tier 2, and the same times then when they start to implement, then you can see which area they need to develop or they need to, yes. But it always need to back again to the members, the countries where they have good faith. But look, what I mean is, ASEAN is especially, we all are community based. We always like we gonna it's community based. We always like people oriented community, and yeah, that's the idea of like helping and work together. Anyway, Carol.
Yeah, thanks. I just thought it might be a tiny bit interesting to take a sideways glance at the pandemic treaty. And we happen to be in Taiwan, and the best read that I've ever had on WHO law and the international health regulations was by Chung Fa Lo, who I understand is presently the ambassador, effectively, for Taiwan at the WTO. And he wrote this fantastic book, and you can see all this parallel between WTO law, the SPS agreement, and international pandemic law. But the point I'm really making, it goes more to what we've been discussing, because recently I was looking over the new pandemic treaty to see what does it really do with substance. There's a huge amount in there and in the revised international health regulations that is more kind of process oriented. And a lot of it is around capacity building, technology, transfer, etc., and of actual commitments to support that financially with a financial mechanism, etc. But when I look for the real nitty gritty, I was really interested to find in the pandemic agreement there is a specific provision with a numerical figure on it, so that I think it was for health products specifically, there is an actual commitment to make available, and then they put a figure on it. It may have been 20% of production to those in need in other countries. I'm sure the figure was controversial. I'm sure there were proposals to have a higher figure. But I thought this was a really concrete example of setting something aside. And I'm not sure whether it goes to, tier 2 unanticipated emergencies or maybe tier 3 acute emergencies, but it might be the equivalent of a tier 2 provision, but in international health law.
We have another question, I know, and if there's other people wanting to chime in, please do. Vishaka.
It's more of a reply to your question about the current geopolitics and how to reconcile these issues. So as all of us know that the current discussion is about what the US is doing and what the EU is doing under its Green Deal. And I'll again relate this to the outcome of the SPS declaration on SFS. Eventually, we didn't see any outcome in MC13, right? So nothing happened. The declaration died down. And one of the main reasons behind this was that there was no consensus between US and the EU. There was no consensus on even how to define the concept of SFS or sustainable agriculture. And then issues, very, very sensitive issues like regulation of GMOs came up in relation to discussion on sustainable agriculture and food security. And then we know that US is a proponent of that, and then EU has a very conservative stand. So there was no common consensus on how to go about defining or even regulating concepts like SFS and sustainable agriculture. But yes, there was no multilateral outcome as such, but then the EU is still regulating under there is a chapter on SFS under its FTAs, and then there's a whole lot of initiatives like sustainable labeling, etc., under its Green Deal. So I think the outcome of the SPS declaration was again linked to the same issue of how these two major power blocks are regulating in their own national spheres.
Okay. So, tier 2 never been used, but it's a part of the mechanism. So if you don't use just one, it's never been used. Is it inefficient or ineffective in your point?
No. The only question I have, well, there's a bigger question that I have, and I'll get to yours in a second, right? So if it's never been used, that's fine, right? You have an option, you pick an option, and you don't have to pick an option, that's fine. The only thing I'm saying is that the trickiness with two, in my mind, is that it's the first one you can anticipate and you can budget for and you can plan for. The third one is we have reserves and we're willing to share them in times of need because we want to help someone in need, right? The third one is unanticipated, but no contract, right? And the second one is that's unanticipated but no contract, but not an emergency as such. Well, countries just don't avail themselves of this option. That's fine from my perspective. There's nothing wrong with that. Again, maybe the legal realist in me comes through too much, right? Yes, there's still some kind of SFS somewhere in the EU trade agreements, but will they ever want to enforce it? Or is it just a signaling device? Is it just a virtue signaling of some sort at this point? Because as Klaus Blank told me in the email, well, it seems a lot more hard-nosed now, partially, I assume, that's not his words, mine, partially in light of what's happening in Washington, D.C. and the impact that has in other places. We know the EU position with respect to negotiations. I'm looking at you, Ashutosh, and I'm looking at you, Vishaka, with respect to India, has softened considerably. The same is true with respect to Indonesia, where certain things that were held in really high demand by the EU have softened considerably because the EU wants to get certain deals done in order to have a more united front, which is, I think, is sensible. Would I like to have higher environmental standards? Yes. Are they achievable at the moment? I'm much more doubtful than maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago. So we have time for one more round, and I have sort of looked at my questions again, and I can make I can make one more round, sort of ask you one question, but in different shades and categories. So the one for let me start off with Michelle. Well, let me start off with Ashutosh. I think that's actually easier for me. So it sort of goes towards the developing country status of, say, India or other developing countries. That there are some concerns that sustainability standards and social clauses in trade agreements form this new anti-development agenda. And between the three of us, we've had this conversation when we started writing on SFS. What mechanisms, sort of more procedurally, do you think can ensure that these standards support rather than hinder equitable food security outcomes? Like, what can we do even today? And I think there's some stuff that can be done today. No, hang on a second. That was for Caroline. Sorry. Sorry, it's becoming a bit messy here on my. Ashutosh, you asked this question of food sovereignty, sort of a similar vein, right? Food sovereignty makes me feel really squeamish because I'm a child of the 1990s in that sense, or 1970s, growing up in the 90s, and sovereignty is for me not a great word. But I think the pendulum is moving back in that direction, and so the question is, how do we deal with that? Because some people say it puts the people at the heart of food systems and policies rather than the demands of markets and corporations. I, as you know, don't buy that notion as much, but if we can incorporate some elements of SFS in international trade, how do these worlds clash and what can be done to reconcile them? And now, Michelle, I come to you. Again, if you look at these initiatives within ASEAN, balancing national autonomy with collective resilience, what are the obstacles to achieve that? Again, it always revolves around the same issue, right? So sovereignty on the one hand versus, and so we have about 5 minutes or so left. Make of it what you will.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. The hot seat with the red mic. Okay. All right. So we had a little bit of notice of this question, and there was another related question we also had notice of. So combining kind of the notes on both to talk about standards and trying to help them support rather than hinder equitable food outcomes. And in general, maybe just make them more agreeable. Yeah, so that standards become a more available mechanism because they can satisfy more parties, and really top of the head stuff, but ensuring widespread involvement in the design. And I know when they're private sector standards, there's a lot of contingencies there. Widespread involvement in developing processes for monitoring and accountability around standards. And also having monitoring and accountability procedures, if you're not meeting the standards, mechanisms to investigate why in a supportive way and try and assist so that industries can be nurtured, if they're not that far off, especially. So more systems, I guess, have realistic aims with the standards. Obviously going for interoperability, that's been a word we've heard quite a lot about. I don't know whether you can build any kind of transitional time frames into some standards regimes. I don't know that that's been discussed, but it might be interesting, and having different levels within them. But then in terms of actually critical areas like food supply, maybe we need some kind of real-time feedback processes on effects in critical areas, probably not just food, but including food. Yeah.
Yes. So the quote from the paper, it's largely to indicate that there are discussions existing obviously, we don't want some red revolution or a communist approach to this. The idea is that food system is inherently tied to the culture. So everywhere you see they have different food habits, etc. It's tied to a number of things, maybe historical context or purely cultural context. The problem is unilateral standard development, which is not a problem for the food system, which is a problem in other areas as well when we talk about sustainability wider in the wider term. So this parallel to food sovereignty was only linked from the perspective that those who grow the food, statistically speaking, smallholder farmers grow largely almost entire food. It's largely smallholder, and that is also true in the case of India. We have small landholding capacity also. So that's why they need to be put wider stakeholder consultation. So that was the perspective. Now, if I have to honestly answer, it's sustainable food system, will it help India or does it only create barriers? I would say while it may create some barrier, but it will also help because if you see Indian food security program, India has been one of the major proponent of food security at the WTO, carving out exceptions, etc. So Indian government supplies smaller quantities of basic grain items, wheat and paddy, etc., to some hundreds of millions of people on a monthly basis. If it's not supplied, they won't have anything to eat. It's related to other economic factors, but at the same time, it's the reality of the world that we live in. But food system is also linked to the healthy and nutritious food. So I think there is also a scope of wider collaboration, of gaining something from this. The only point that I'll again come back to is that there is need to have a wider consultation. So rather than unilateral, it has to be more parties involvement. I won't say multilateral because of the current scenario, but I mean, it inevitably has to be multilateral in an ideal world. That's it. Thank you so much.
Again, very difficult. I don't think ChatGPT can answer this, but I try my best. Yeah, well, so I think like the one of the biggest obstacles, like they need to trust and believe in the tools that they have. So sometimes it's kind of like, so ASEAN has like actually many tools, but sometimes it's underutilized. So for example, this ASEAN +3 Emergency Rice Reserve and ASEAN Food Security Information System, much of the support actually come from Japan. And when they have, for example, I give example the ASEAN Food Security Information System, and this is they try to have integrated informations. They produce very useful report. They try to use the forecasting model and so on, very technical. Actually, when I look at their website, I do not really understand because it's very technical, and also their report. So they look at the outlook, the rice outlook. They have early warning information and so on. So they produce very useful, but at the same time, when they want to establish permanent mechanism for ASEAN food security information, they fail. So now this AFSIS, the ASEAN Food Security Information System, is more like a project led by Thailand, supported by Japan. And they also, well, this information system, they also rely on the nationals, right? The national focal point to provide more information. So if there is no information coming from each country members, it won't work. So again, I say it needs more to trust the tools and actually aware they have these tools, trust these tools, and utilize these tools.
All right, let me just try to put some finishing words on all of this. So the first question, or the first comment I have is sort of in a way of a question, which is, were the 1990s what I call the kumbaya moment of international cooperation? Maybe they were just a blip. And this whole creation of these multilateral institutions was just an aberration in history, and maybe so a question mark behind that. Ricardo may then be on the way out. That may be a good thing or a bad thing. That depends on your own point of view. I don't think the interdependence of the world goes away completely, just to be clear. But I do think that the sort of we remain in this volatile place for quite some time. When we had this discussion in other panels about sort of pendulum swings here, there, everywhere, yada yada yada. The one thing that I will say, and some people will say this is a plug for my own podcast, but yes, you should watch it and listen to it. I interviewed Stephen Vaughn, who used to be the the United States Trade Representative General Counsel. And his words, that one thing that I remember is, and I think this is the way we're traveling at the moment, that, and I can't put this together, it's somewhere on social media and so forth, but he's like, the American, Marcus, you have to understand, he literally said it like this, Marcus, you have to understand, the American people voted for Donald Trump, and they will, and he will implement their wishes. Now, I thought their wishes may not be exactly what's being implemented, but I think we're living in this world where we're having a much more inward-looking conversation that doesn't look at some of these other things. There may be, however, and this is the hopeful note on which I will end, a world out there that's characterized again by much greater cooperation, which we will need in order to tackle some of these challenges that we talked about today: climate change, social cohesion, social mobility, and so forth, which I personally am a big fan of, but let's leave it there. Can you please join me in thanking our panelists for what I thought was a wonderful discussion on a fairly complex set of issues. Caroline Foster, Ashutosh Kashyap, and Michelle Limenta. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for coming. Before you leave, would you? Yes, that's what I'm doing right now. Perfect.